Is this close enough?
Yeah.
Okay.
So these mics are pretty good. You'd have to eat them a little bit, but
okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So if you just pretend that you're like you're doing a stand-up routine, and you are in front of a brick wall, like old Seinfeld bit. Yeah. So what is the deal with whales?
I know.
From ScienceSortOf.com, you're listening to Science Sort of.
Hello, everyone out there in podcast land. You are listening to Science Sort of, the show where we talk about things that are science, things that are sort of science, and things that wish they were science. I am your host, Ryan Haupt. This is episode 298, and our theme this week is the whale identity. It's like the Bourne Identity, but it's about whales. And you'll soon see why, because this week I am chatting with Dr. Nick Pyenson, who is the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History's curator of marine mammal fossils and author of the book Spying on Whales, which is the reason we sat down to chat. So because we both live in DC, we were fortunate enough to get to record in person a few weeks ago, and we were able to do so at one of my favorite bars in DC, which is called Room 11. It's in the Columbia Heights neighborhood. And so because we were in a bar, we were able to do our full conversation and include a What Are You Drinking segment sort of in the middle, maybe towards the tail end, in between cocktails. So because this interview really has everything you need, I'm not going to break in at all, and we're just going to go straight through. Enjoy my chat with Nick. You will find the show notes for the things we talk about, principally his book, a few other book recommendations, and links to his social media in the show notes for this episode at ScienceOver.com. And with that, let's go chat with Nick. So I'm being joined in person at Room 11, my favorite cocktail bar here in this district of Columbia, by Nick Pyenson, former guest of the show.
Oh, yeah,
I looked it up.
right.
Do you remember what episode it was?
Gee whiz, that's back when you still had the moose icon.
We still have the moose icon.
Really?
It's just been updated. It's a classier version now. We have a designer and everything.
And it was a rowdy conversation. It was about gray whales. Man, that might have been 6 years ago.
Yeah, I think it was in like 2011, and it was episode 97. We're about to hit 300.
Holy
so
cow, congratulations
It's been
to you
a
guys.
while since
Yeah,
you've
big
been
fans.
on.
Fans.
When we last had you on,
I mean, I'm a big fan. Sorry,
we really just talked about that one paper about the gray whales.
Right,
so I'm really looking forward to this conversation because you have just put out a book called Spying on Whales, the past, present, and future of Earth's most awesome creatures.
Yeah.
And so I have been reading it, and I'm really excited to talk to you about it.
Thanks. It's... I know we can go in a lot of different places about this, but you can...
Well, one thing I noticed that we didn't really talk about the first time you were on the show is how did you first get interested in studying whales? Because you talk in the book about how, like, you liked whales as a kid, along with a lot of other interests that we probably shared as kids, but how did you end up becoming a person who is focusing on whales?
I think you would probably understand the reasons for getting into paleontology.
The list you wrote in the book is pretty... I never had an Egyptology phase,
really?
but
Okay.
other than that, I was pretty in line with your list of things.
So it's funny because I think you get that, and many other people probably identify with that strongly. So I put them in the bestiary of things that I cared about, but in no particular preference relative to gnarly other extinct things. Mm-hmm. And it really took a series of coincidences in college to set me on this course of looking at the evolutionary history of whales. That's to create kind of a framework for thinking about why they are so interesting in the first place. Yeah, they're amazing, and they have this really interesting evolutionary history that we can know about from the fossil record, that we do, it's 50 million years of history, and for some paleontologists, that's not much time. But if you deal with bones, if you deal with backboned animals, 50 million years is a good chunk of time for a lot of interesting things to happen.
Oh, yeah.
And for whales, that's the story that explains how they got to where they are today from terrestrial ancestors that were no big shakes back in the Eocene. I mean, I kind of tried to say this in the book, that if you went back 50 million years ago, you probably couldn't put your finger on the terrestrial mammal that would eventually become the whales today down the line.
Yeah.
So, and there were a lot of false starts and experiments in different directions. But eventually there was a lineage that begat whales in the water, and that all happened in about 8 to 10 million years.
As a general note, I really enjoyed in this book how you frame the way we think about evolution, because it's so often depicted linearly. And you talk a lot about false starts, and you talk about how, because we're looking at a story where we know the end, we know that we end up with modern whales, it's easy to put it together as if it all happened sequentially.
Yeah.
But it's not how it happened. And you lay that case out very nicely.
Thanks. I mean, I think that's generally just really important. And that's, I don't think I'm saying anything that anybody else did before me. You know, Stephen Jay Gould, if you read his stuff, that worldview is kind of written in.
But it's a misconception people still have about evolution. So I think it's, you have to hammer it home every chance you get.
I agree completely. And so, but at the same time, I didn't want to make it too much of a huge macroevolutionary theory lesson. And it's striking that we still haven't learned from Gould's lessons, we being like the general American public. And I gave a tour today, just for instance, at the museum. And the person who was looking at the fossil, it was actually the jawbones of this critter that I brought a replica here of.
Is this a 3D print?
Yeah, a 3D print of Maya Bellina's jaws. So this is a new fossil whale, like new as of like a week ago.
Oh, cool.
Of a fossil whale that we described that has neither teeth nor baleen. That's kind of the big, we can talk about that more in a sec. But he was looking at that, and I tried to explain how it fit into the evolutionary history of baleen whales, the filter feeding ones. And he, very quickly it became clear to me that he understood. He said, "Oh, it's a missing link. It's in the chain." And we're just incredibly burdened in general with that trope. I think we'd almost.
I think
call
burden's
it that.
the right word, because there's no such thing as a missing link.
Right.
That concept is faulty because it implies that everything is on its way somewhere else, as opposed to just being itself in that moment. And then, if you're trying to undermine evolution, every time you find a new fossil, all you've done is create two new missing links. Right. And so we can't ever win by thinking about things that way. Winning being getting more people to accept that evolution's a thing.
Right. And I mean, it's just funny to me. You probably can see this image that Darwin drew of the tree branching through time divergences, and it was one of the few illustrations that Darwin formally put in Origin of Species in one of the later editions.
Once he decided to become a biologist after giving up on geology.
Right. And so that's something we still have a hard time dealing with, and we're more than 150 years after Darwin. So it's just kind of shocking that for icons of evolution, literally like the graphical ways that we understand how evolution works, at least in the United States, I think that's still a problem. Probably globally too. It's generally a huge misconception, and I think so. It's always warranted to go back over it. And whales, in particular, because we know a lot about their early evolutionary history. These transformations that happen in critters as bizarre as Ambulocetus.
To me, it's weird that Ambulocetus isn't still around, because that lifestyle of living at the water to land margin seems to be a very good strategy for a lot of different things.
Pinnipeds have been doing it for 30 million years.
So I guess the pinnipeds have just taken over that Ambulocetus role.
I mean, that's something I didn't say in the book, but I think if you know more about the range of marine mammals that are out there, pinnipeds are seals, sea lions, walruses.
I'm just so glad I was in a lab with Morgan Churchill so that I can actually say in Elaearctos every time I walk into Julie's Objects of Wonder exhibit. I guess it's not Julie's exhibit, but she did a lot of the work on it.
Beautiful, beautiful exhibit. That's
and a beautiful fossil.
One of my favorite exhibits, and I think, so in Elaearctos, which is a 23 or so million year old fossil relative of sea lions, seals, and walruses. It's more closely related to walruses than it is to seals or sea lions.
For a while, we weren't sure that was a monophyly.
Right. Yeah, that was a big, huge issue.
Monophyly meaning a single common ancestor for that whole group.
There's like 3 people who still think that, and they're wrong. So seals have been doing pinnipeds have been doing that thing for 23 million years, and they're perfectly adequate doing that amphibious lifestyle. An amphibious lifestyle in a marine to terrestrial transition zone right on the shores, right? This is something I thought about saying, but I didn't. It's not like pinnipeds are one day going to become whales. Like it's really hard to forecast that. But in my view, they've had 23 million years or more to actually make that full transition to become obligate aquatic mammals, and they haven't. So you have to ask yourself, like, well, why not? They must be doing it pretty well.
Yeah. This is something I was thinking about while reading the book. There's that population of wolves in the Pacific Northwest that spend a ton of their time in the water, and like even feed on like fish and
so
shellfish.
their teeth
and
are
stuff.
probably super interesting to
I
look
would
at.
love to do some isotopes and some microware on those, which are, I mean, that's the 1-2 punch I throw at a lot of things, but I think that group in particular would be really interesting. But also, like, I wonder, in my mind's eye, if I needed to create an image of what those earliest pinnipeds probably looked like, that's probably like thinking about like maybe a more stocky bear-like wolf, but wading out into the water, spending more time there, seeing that there's food there.
I mean, if we think Pakicetus is showing us what that ancestral stage looks like, they were as slinky as a wolf.
Yeah.
I mean, but they're hooved mammals, which is so, I mean, that's the thing about trying to understand it. It's related to even-toed hooved mammals.
Right.
But it kind of looked like a wolf because it had meat-eating teeth. It had these, if you look at its two eyes, if you look at the skull of Pakicetus, what we have, and there's not that much,
And
actually.
do we say that Pakicetus is the earliest whale? Is that the...
Well, so what is a whale? I would say it's everything that's more closely related to whales than it is to the next branch that's alive on that tree.
Hippos?
Which are hippos.
Okay.
So about 10 years ago, Mark Clements and Hans Thewissen and a bunch of other people described Indohyus. They described more material belonging to this previously named Eocene mammal. Very complex story
My
to
former
explain.
lab mate, not Mark, but my former lab mate from Mark's lab has a tattoo, and people always ask him, why do you have a tattoo of a skeleton of a possum on your arm?
Yeah, kind of looks like, I mean, they're...
It's kind of hunched. And
Right, and Hans once put the foot bones, the ankle bones of Indohyus in my hands. They're like dime size. They are remarkably. That was a
Really?
small.
Tiny.
Yeah, I mean, when they say raccoon size, they mean it. That was a raccoon sized animal. But clearly, I don't draw a firm line on it's this branch and not the other one for whales. They're all on the way to becoming whales. In the book, I just call them early whales, and it's only once whales go into the water that you see this great divergence into the two houses of living whales. The filter-feeding ones, baleen whales, on one side, and then the echolocating ones, the ones that use sonar.
good ones.
Yeah.
No,
The ones-
just the
sorry,
good ones.
The good ones.
I was just
They're all
trying to-
freaky. They're all super free. Toothed whales.
Yeah.
So that's like sperm whales, killer whales, porpoises, dolphins, river dolphins, beaked whales, narwhals, belugas.
The things we can keep in captivity.
Right. And there was a little lost gray whale that was once kept in captivity for about a few months in San Diego, SeaWorld in San Diego. And we learned a lot about it.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's cool.
That's how we know about heart rate and feeding styles and like how much to feed a filter feeding whale in captivity.
So, as a sloth person, myself, I felt a lot of methodological kinship, not just with
I
the
didn't
Thalassocnus
illustrate
stuff.
sloths in here, but I did mention there's two call-outs to aquatic sloths.
There are,
It should be
yep.
in the index. So we can,
So Thalassocnus is the genus of marine sloth that you found in the Cerebellina.
I was so surprised. I could not believe. I remember the day we found the femur. That's a cool story. Do you want to?
Sure. Yeah. Let's get into it.
So,
Well, but
I'll let you
my
preamble,
point
yeah.
my point was when you talk about the difficulties that come with studying an animal like whales. They live in hard to get to places. You can't see them most of the time. They're enigmatic and they have a weird lifestyle that's very different than a lot of other mammals. I felt a lot of slothiness in that statement too.
Yeah.
Except sloths are the smallest they've ever been, as opposed to whales.
That's pretty interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think
been.
the way I get people into aquatic sloths is one, baby sloth videos, which is so clearly the right. My view.
I mean, my Twitter profile pic is me holding a sloth because why
You
wouldn't
cannot
it be?
lose.
Yeah.
You cannot lose.
Yeah, I didn't choose to study an animal that would become famous on the internet. It just happened, and I got lucky.
They were cool before you. And in these pictures of sloths dropping down from the trees and swimming through the water, kind of doggy paddling. So it's clear that sloths were kind of pre-adapted to moving through the water. And I think for Thalassocnus, the aquatic sloth from Western South America, the remarkable thing is the Atacama's been a desert for at least 20 million years, if not maybe 100. We don't know the antiquity of that arid desert environment, but it's probably been some time. And whatever it is, it definitely includes the entirety of the evolutionary history of Thalassocnus. So it's not like Thalassocnus dropped down from the trees into the coast.
We don't know how sloths got up into the trees. That's a huge sloth mystery. I don't want this to become about sloths,
okay.
but it's a
Hashtag
Thalassocnus
not a sloth episode.
Well, for as much as any episode of the show cannot be about sloths.
I just saw that you're wearing a sloth shirt.
I am wearing a sloth shirt.
You can't get away from it.
I wanted you to be able to recognize me. We've never met before, but
I'm the dude on the street corner with the sloth t-shirt. So Sarabiano was going on. I talk about it in the book, this like slow, it was kind of...
Which means Whale Hill.
Whale Hill, and this is a site in northern Chile, near in the Atacama Desert. And we were there for other reasons, and it just became apparent that this site had a lot of fossil whale skeletons. So in the book, I described this kind of process of realization on my part, kind of an moment of like, wow, I have a much bigger task before me than I really realized.
What year was that?
This is 2011. Yeah, this is... I had been to the site before, but it was in 2011 that they actually started doing excavations and removing part of the roadside to make room for the other lane of traffic, the northbound lane. And in doing so...
Of the Pan American Highway.
Of the Pan American Highway. Yeah. So why are you expanding the Pan American Highway in this remote...
Wasn't pan enough.
It wasn't big enough. Well, I mean, this is the year after the Copiapó mine disaster, where 33 miners were buried and they rescued all 33.
I remember that,
There's a movie about it. There's a great book.
It was when they realized they had a viable method for getting them out, a bunch of them tried to like be the last one to stay down there because they wanted to be the world record holder for the longest time spent underground.
It's an amazing story. There's a great PBS Nova show about it. It was released like a month after they rescued everybody. It's remarkable how quickly that studio turned it around. So this is maybe an hour up the road from that.
Okay.
So Chile has mineral resources that the rest of the world wants, and to procure that, to bring it out of the earth, you need mining equipment. And that mining equipment is big.
Right.
It needs to be transported up and down the Pan American Highway. So expanding a single lane road into a a 4-lane road is why we found Cerro Bayan in the first place. It's the accident of geopolitics for why we found that site. And then we realized I try to explain this in the book. Yes, they're the 40-odd complete whale skeletons. Mind-blowing.
Yeah. Just
trying to wrap your mind around that. But then we realized it wasn't just whales. And you're a vertebrate paleontologist, so when you're out in the field, you're like, yeah, any bone. Mm-hmm. I'm agnostic. Just show me bone.
And once we've talked about this on the show recently, but there's that idea of the search image. And once your eyes learn how to see what it is you're out in the field looking for, you can't see it everywhere. Yeah.
Yeah. And so when you see it, you're like, well, what is this? Is this whale? Is it something? I mean, you're pretty open to any kind of possibility. And we started finding seals. We started finding billfish, because fish really looks different from mammal. And you're like, okay. We actually thought it was seabird at first. We thought it was a giant pelargonithid.
Oh, weird.
Giant bony-toothed seabird from the Miocene. Actually, from
the entire Cenozoic. Are the teeth actually bone, or are they beak material?
They are. And what's really cool about those teeth, they obey a fractal pattern.
Huh.
They grow fractally along the teeth.
Weird.
Super cool. There's some Fourier analysis to be done on that.
Okay.
Super, super cool project.
You did talk. It was funny. You talked in the book about how you would be staring at fossils at that site, and you'd be like, "There's a couple dissertations worth of data." I like that you chunked it out in units of dissertations.
That is totally the way I think about these things, because, the real value of a site that rich is the legacy that it can provide. And so that's where 3D digitization became so important. Mm-hmm. That was, that's still a very nascent thing, but man, 7 years ago, that was totally novel to do that.
And to do it in a desert.
High risk, time sensitive. I mean, I tried to really capture those...
that sense of urgency.
Yeah, those heart palpitation issues, because I was I was at the start of my career. It was one of my first big projects, and it was kind of I tried to articulate the holy aspect about it.
Well, you did, because you said you talked in the book about how you were there to do a reasonable but influential project on dating and stratigraphy and a lot of early paleontology. Anytime you find a new area that you want to exploit paleontologically, that's the sort of work you have to do just to get everything in place for the actual digging and the fossils. Right. And that got completely sidelined for this, like you said, high risk, high reward.
High risk, high reward. That's that's kind of the rubric I think about these things in. And I was ambivalent about it, and I tried to really clarify that. And it's only through talking about it, talking it through with your colleagues, that you begin to it's almost like a gnarled kind of, it's a rat's nest of a problem in front of you.
If we want to do the geology thing, it's like the rock tumbler. You have this rough idea or shape, exactly. And you smooth it out by tumbling it around for a while.
Right. And that's where the value of your social network, we do things in collaboration to a large degree. It's not to say that individuals don't make a difference, but I think science today it takes so much specialized knowledge to get to the point where you can go do your own science, that you really do need collaborators who you trust, and we're all different people. We have different quirks. Sometimes we're reliable about things, sometimes we're not. And I think that heterogeneity of people is something really valuable to talk about in the process of science. Science is not a cookbook. You don't show up at the office and say, okay, open to page 302. I guess I'm going to cook this today.
Right.
I mean, there's some laboratory processes that are very cookbook, but the big picture of how you do science is very creative.
Well, a lot of times they won't you don't get to the cookbook stage until after you've already come up with a question and justified why that question is important and collected the material. Like the cookbook is almost kind of just tidying up the mess you've made along the way.
And there's a lot of it. So that's the organic kind of creative process. And I really wanted to highlight that we weren't expecting Sarabina. That just happened. And I'm proud of the way we turned on that fastball and hung in there to actually deliver on what I thought was the promise of finding a site like that was time sensitive, that was doing something different. And so today when I go into the National Museum of Natural History, you can see B33, that's the field number for this fossil whale skeleton, printed in full on the wall of the Curious Auditorium. And I remember what it was like. I walk up the auditorium steps and kind of turn my head on my side. I'm like, yep, those were some crazy, crazy days. And we did it. And the only way we did it was by teamwork. It wasn't any one person. It was international field work. It was high stakes. We didn't really know the outcome. We were using new techniques, but it was drawing on the expertise of a lot of people. And I think that's important to know in the process of doing science, because then you realize, it is a team. Teamwork is a key component, and everybody on the team can contribute. And so you have to build your team carefully.
Oh yeah, super carefully.
Yeah. One bad apple can really
you can throw a wrench in things to mix a metaphor there. So what did happen at this fossil site?
So we'll get back. Okay, so sloths. I'm trying to create the arc.
I don't even care about this. I'm willing to focus. I'm willing to focus on whales. No,
okay.
I want to hear the story.
Okay.
I'm just saying.
I'll finish with the sloths.
I don't want the people listening to think that I'm pushing a sloth agenda on you.
We'll end it. So, because there were sloths found all around. We'd found bits and pieces of sloths. One very nice skeleton just to the side of Sarabina, about a kilometer away. And because, in the book I talked about this, all these faults, there's just faults everywhere. So the sequence stratigraphy, the sequence of rocks, the succession of rocks in the caldera basin, how they're stacked in time, going from oldest to youngest, is hard to map out because this is an active tectonic area. There's, a lot of fault. It's like California.
Right.
And so you can walk 500 meters and go across 3 faults.
Yeah.
And because layers don't get deposited in the same way, you might lose a layer.
There were sites that I had to go map during my intro to field geology courses at Santa Cruz that regularly made undergrads cry. Yeah. You just looked at it, I can't figure it out.
Where did it go? It was it's over there, it's not here.
Until you've had either just enough experience or a really good structure teacher, it just doesn't come together.
Right, and so you have to be it's that 4-dimensional vision of okay, there's faulting and we're losing, this area is pinching out, and I actually expect this to change into that environment laterally, and so through time you're gonna that's the geologist hat that you wear, and then you switch to biologist hat when you find bone in sequence.
I love that banner in Last American Dinosaur where it says what is paleontology, and they have the 2 words, and then the first O of ology is the intersection where they show that paleontology exists at the intersection of geology and biology.
Absolutely, and I think that's what makes it so much fun and so challenging. Really, I mean, the kinds of questions you want to answer, you need to know both. The questions may go along the spectrum in either direction or in the quadrant, but so sloths. So we realized that we should be really paying attention to what we were finding along either side of the road cut. And one of our collaborators, Brazilian, actually he's Argentinian by birth, but he lives in Brazil, Mario Casual, was poking around the north end of the site, and he pulled out from the road cut the upper part of a femur of Thalassocnos. It was clear as day.
Sloths have very distinct, ground sloths have very distinctive femurs.
It was Xenarthran, and I was like, oh my God, that is a aquatic sloth. Holy great.
And people ask me, how do we know that they were aquatic? And I tell them, like, because we find them next to whales.
They're found in marine rocks with adjacent to desert environments. And so we found that, and we brought it back to the local museum at night. And another Mario, actually Tuareg in the book, said, "Oh my God, I have the other part of that bone," and like went into the collection, pulled it out. And we have a photo.
Amazing.
I'll tweet it out, but it's a photo of putting the two pieces together, and the look of elation. And that sometimes happens, and it's a remarkable thing when you find two parts of the same bone, sometimes years apart. I mean, there's a story about, I think, a dinosaur bone that was found 100 years apart in New Jersey, and these are two parts that belong to the same
animal, the same individual animal. Yeah,
that's its leg bone. So that's how we know. That's one. That is, I think, we also have a jawbone. So we have, it's not abundant.
Because I knew there were teeth. I knew there were some teeth.
Oh yeah, there's teeth. I mean, and so we think we're still, I was just on a G-Chat conversation about what is that? What species is that? And I'm pretty sure it's Natans, which I think is the...
So there are 4 or 5 species within the genus?
Well, you tell me. You're the...
I mean, yeah.
I think there's not 5. I think there's probably 4. I think it's oversplit. But what's interesting is that you just find it through different successions of rocks in Peru. So there's at least 5 named species.
And they have increasingly marine adapted bones.
Exactly. Longer snouts, changes in teeth, changes in the thickness of their...
Pachyosteosclerosis,
Pachyosteosis and osteosclerosis, 2 different processes thickening the bones.
But basically thickening it on the inside and thickening it on the outside.
Yep.
So which is good for shallow diving, which is why you don't see it in whales, because whales go too deep for it to be a super useful adaptation.
They have no problem diving very deep. Yeah. So...
Oh, I meant to... I wrote down a joke that I was going to make at the beginning of this interview that I forgot. And I said
we can try that again.
To honor... we're going to start over. To honor the whales, I think we should hold our breath this entire interview. But...
That's pretty good. I mean, that's... actually, I met... So the metaphor I talked about, or the turn of phrase that I used about holding your breath for to chase your dinner, I borrowed that from Mike Castellini, who's dean of the School of Ocean Sciences at the University of Alaska, who's a seal specialist.
Okay.
And I remember him giving a talk about elephant seals, which are also champion deep divers. Yeah, I mean, they're up there with... in terms of depth, with the deepest diving cetaceans and duration.
And the fact that, like, I think, I'm not sure how much whales do this as well, but from what I understand, seals, in order to conserve energy during the dive, they basically go to sleep.
Whales do the same thing.
And then they wake up in the deepest part of the ocean, hunt for dinner without breathing.
Right.
And I loved the phrase that you used about how, like, whales almost look annoyed that they have to come up and breathe.
Yeah. I also borrowed that from a colleague, Megan McKenna, who was looking at beaked whale data. Beaked whales are mysterious, enigmatic, hyper diverse. They're the second richest group in terms of number of species of whales. We hardly know much about them. A few species we know a fair bit, but not really that much. And she was looking at the dive profile data, or just showing it to me on her laptop, and she's like, yeah, it's almost like they don't want to be breathing air. Like, being at the surface is a burden to them. They'd rather...
I can't imagine what that feels like. Like, I saw a video, there's that video that gets spread around the internet of a turtle like going to sleep on the sponge. And I'm like, but you're not... You need to breathe. You can't go to sleep. Like, I don't understand what these animals are doing.
I mean, for marine reptiles, I'm like, whatever. But
take a day off from breathing.
Yeah, but for marine mammals, marine reptiles can go. They can get hit by a car and still be fine. They can, they have crazy physiology relative to mammals. But it's marine mammals where I'm like, the fact that molecular adaptations for deep diving are convergent between seals and whales should be one of the highest forms of evidence for natural selection that I can think of for evolutionary biology textbooks. I mean, the adaptations for diving in that way they're achieved convergently. And the last time a seal and a whale shared a common ancestor is probably the Middle Jurassic, So
I do wish I could store oxygen in my muscles for later use.
Yeah, and this is the big question for any marine mammal biologist, physiologist, is what is the cost? Like, that is not coming without cost. Yeah. And they do it multiple times a day. Beaked whales are going down to 3,000 feet and back up several times a day. And it seems like many of these deep diving whales do shut down for the dive down.
There's a really incredible video I saw where it's a camera attached to it. It's rear facing on a dolphin, and the dolphin starts to go down, and it's gives a few really good fluke paddles, and then everything just stops, and it just planes out, and you can tell that it's still diving at a really sharp rate. But
And their chest cavity has to compress because that's a negative space, no matter how much they've exhaled with their last breath before diving to get rid of all air. Because empty space is your enemy.
Right.
Any empty spaces in their head, they perfuse with blood. It's really nuts.
Are you a scuba diver? Do you?
No, I don't.
Okay.
I shouldn't be diving. I've tried a few times, and I'm like, this is not for me.
No. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
I've swam among elephant seals around Ano Nuevo Island.
Yep.
But
Spent some
that
time
was
up there.
freaky stuff. I wouldn't
want to be in the water with an
that's
elephant seal.
in the water with a multi-thousand pound
I don't
animal.
like being on the land near elephant seals. They smell bad. They're loud. They're mean. They
It's freaky.
when they do their catastrophic molts, it's just disgusting.
I did that for a fossil whale. There was a fossil whale found by a UCSC grad student back in the 80s. He found it on Nuevo Island. Collected the skull, gave it to Frank Perry, and it's Brian Fadley, actually, who's a NOAA researcher right now.
Okay.
It turned out to be a whale fall skull. Kind of a cool story. Yeah, I think I talked about it in the book. So
You talked about going down Ano Nuevo for a fossil once.
yeah,
but,
that was
yeah.
that was it shows up in the book, I guess. So deep diving is we're talking.
Oh,
about,
you did, because that was the one you found the clams.
Yeah, so
Yep, I do remember that.
Yeah, that was I mentioned that in the book. So I remember sitting in the auditorium when Mike Castellini was giving a talk about physiological adaptations to deep diving, and he talked about imagine being an elephant seal, holding your breath, and then running up and down the auditorium for 2 hours.
Yeah. It's insane.
To go chase your squid meal, and you're living 6 months at sea, before you come back. So, I mean, you've probably had this thought too. That seems crazy today, but would you do that in the Miocene when Megalodon was around?
Right.
I'm not sure I would.
Or the shark popularly known as Megalodon.
Yeah.
Like Prince.
Megalodon in quotes.
Megalodon. You mean that giant clam from the
Yeah,
Jurassic?
Exactly.
I did see somebody change the new poster for the Meg, and they photoshopped out the shark and put in the clam. Is it a clam? It's some sort of bivalve.
It's not a vertebrate. So, so I think that's, just underscores that past worlds were not just kind of different, but so different in ways that we sometimes can know and don't really know.
I liked how you said that in some respects, traveling back in time would be a little bit just like seeing nature through a fever dream, because like everything would kind of make sense, and you'd be like, this all sort of scans. Like these are animals that they all look, these are definitely mammals, and they look, but they're just off. Something's weird.
I mean, the Miocene is as far back as I go most of the time. Sometimes I'll get back to the Oligocene, but I think it's very different for a paleontologist working in the Mesozoic. Mm-hmm. If you're right after the Permo-Triassic mass extinction, that is when everything gets rearranged into the modern world. I mean, the world we have today, we've inherited from that last big. I mean, it's not the most recent one, but it was the big doozy, and so. When you're finding those fossils, I think you have even a harder time to the ratios of carnivores to herbivores is totally off, and we don't really understand why. I mean, food webs are not structured the same way, whether you're on land or sea, in the early Triassic or late Permian than we have today.
And this is why we mercilessly mock dinosaur paleontologists at every opportunity.
I mean, how you know anything about the past, and that's the crazy thing. I mean, at the Smithsonian, we have some 40 million fossils, probably a large part of Earth's our humanity's collective knowledge of the past. It's kind of remarkable that we have that much in the first place, given, all the processes that prevent fossils from entering the geologic record. Yes, you talk about
the taphonomy, the filters. I think of them as taphonomic filters. Every time you pass through a filter, you lose something.
I mean, why we have anything direct from the past is remarkable, especially for vertebrates. And so that kind of just underscores...
Especially for animals that spend most of their lives living on top of a type of oceanic crust that's going to get subducted.
Yeah, exactly.
So you not only are, you have to get them into a position where they'll get preserved, but then also wind up on land where we can go find them.
Yeah. So there's no place on the seafloor that's really older than about 200 million years.
Yeah.
But we definitely have billion-year-old rocks on land. So there's something, that asymmetry really underscores how amazing it is to know anything about a marine taxon.
And I did one of those canopy cranes in Panama with Jason Head, and we were talking about how weird is it that this is an environment.
Jason would love this. He would love to know that we're talking about it.
Former guest of the show, Jason Head, go listen to our Titanoboa episode. We were talking about how the canopy is not really an environment that preserves well. So even within an environment, tropical systems are hard anyway, but then even within the tropical system, if you're living up in the trees as opposed to an armadillo burrowing under the ground, you're making it even harder.
Yeah. I mean, So the little we know is remarkable in itself, and that we found it, and that we keep it, So I think a lot of people, the way we talk about the work we do as paleontologists, we have to be really careful about that we're not too casual about just how amazing it is that we have this material, and that it's so different, and that we're able to ask an answerable question about it.
That to me was the hardest thing to learn how to do as a developing scientist, was just learning how to formulate an answerable question. Because I've always had questions, but figuring out how to take one that has some methodology that can be applied on the back end is not a non-trivial thing to learn for a new scientist.
Oh yeah, I mean, and for the kind of tools you use, there's a whole background of foundational knowledge that relies on chemistry and physics.
And if you don't learn that stuff well enough to apply that tool properly, then you will rightly get accused of just treating your mass spec like a black box of magic science. And you say, I put the bone in and the numbers came out and these are the numbers.
You can't do that? I mean,
no, you're not supposed to.
Magic number
they frown on that. They frown on that. They like you to have a little bit more.
Reviewer 3 really takes issue with that.
A little bit.
So I mean, I think for the book, I was trying to imagine the kind of reader who wanted to know what the heck I do with my time. And that person is not a specialist, doesn't know all the jargon and sort of the framework in which we work in, but also is curious, is kind of interested to know more about scientific process. And I don't think there's that many narratives out there that are scientist outward generated. For the most part, science writing is covered by journalists, and no knock against journalists, but it's really different when you hear in the first person voice how you figured something out.
It's one of the reasons we wanted to do this podcast in the first place. 9 years ago.
Yeah, that's cool.
I think that would have been right around when you and I met, because we met when you were still at Berkeley, because Patrick got us that tour of the museum.
I remember that, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that's not only the way I think about my job as a public servant. I've kind of always thought about that. If you've read Orson Scott Card's Ender's Game, Speaker for the Dead has a whole different meaning there. But I kind of think that loose metaphor works for paleontologists, because these objects don't really mean anything to anybody unless you have this framework for explaining its significance. We need to speak for these objects.
Yeah.
And that's what we definitely do in museum settings, in informal educational settings. But what's missing, it's not just the objects themselves. I'm picking up the 3D print of Maya Bellina, but it's the narrative of how we figured it out. I mean, I think, so going back to the reader of the book, they're not going to care. The facts are like, well, whatever, 33 million years old, the new name, whatever. Those may be meaningful to us, but they're not meaningful to the general reader. What is meaningful to the general reader is a story about people, about how people figure things out, about mystery, about, grasping at the bigger answers that we can give, that we can provide as scientists. Yes, that's a new species. And what does it tell us? What's that significance? How does that fit into the big scope of evolution? Or even just like you're part of the tree of life, And I think about all the millions of stories. I mean, for the 162 million specimens at the National Museum of Natural History, there's at least that many stories. You probably don't have time to binge watch all those stories, but some of them are going to be a lot more interesting than others, and people are what make that interesting. So the more that you're able to tell a story about people, and that's why I spend time talking about Tuareg and spend time talking.
He's a character, clearly.
Yeah, he's I still get funny chats from him on WhatsApp and GChat, and that's that. I mean, I think if any professional reflects on the experiences that they find meaningful about the jobs they do. Yeah, it comes down to those relationships you have with people.
Right.
So.
The Office would be a very boring show if the people weren't interesting.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
So you mentioned, how you were thinking about writing the book. How did the book come about? I don't think I know the origin story of.
Well, So the book came about after I had accumulated enough of these crazy times, and the biggest struggle of the book was trying to fit all these stories and these episodic experiences into a broader narrative. What is it about whales that we care about? Very early on, I had this kind of tripart.
Well, they're good for fuel, so that's we care about them.
We can burn them. We can burn their skin, their integument for fuel.
Perfume.
for perfume. Yeah, and there's so much. I mean, it is incredibly rich. Moby Dick being, an icon of American literature, and the context is like it drove an economy in the 19th century. Made New Bedford the wealthiest city in the United States.
Oh, wow.
More so than Boston or New York. I mean, that's kind of remarkable. New Bedford still has the highest number of landings by dollar value in the United States, more so than Dutch Harbor. It's because they bring in scallops.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. So humans, our species, have had this interaction with whales for thousands of years. And they have this evolutionary history. And we care about ships striking them and them getting entangled in fishing gear and going extinct in river systems. I thought that there was scientific narratives that hooked into that whole realm. And I didn't want to be encyclopedic. Like, I didn't want to be order Cetacea from A to Z. Let me start with species 1 and end with species number 80 plus, because I want to be selective about the stories that I told. And I want to make them interesting. I want to make them personal as much as possible, because why not? That would give me familiarity and, real actual texture.
But as scientists, we're so often trying to remove ourselves from the work.
Well,
and so was it difficult for you to write in a way that was narrative about yourself and put yourself in the story? Or did that come pretty quickly once you started writing?
Yeah, it's hard to be like you're asking about self-reflection in some ways. I actually think that scientists should be more first person all the way through. I mean, I try to mentor students in my research group not to write in passive voice whatsoever.
Not even in the methods section?
Not even the methods. We did this. We figured this. Because it's not like it's being done by some prime mover or an automaton. It's not Westworld. It's actually, you are actively doing this. You are telling somebody about, in a report, about what you did. So why not own it?
Yeah.
I think that's, I don't see any bias about that. I mean, because we all are biased.
Who are we kidding, right? Like, it's like you said, I'm not reading. Most of the time I'm reading science at this point. I probably know at least one person on that paper.
Right.
So, like, I'm not imagining that this is just a bunch of robots in a room doing a thing. I know the people. I know why they were interested in this. I probably know some of the stuff they left out of the paper because it didn't work or whatever.
Exactly.
So,
so science is a very human enterprise. And there's more than that. There's more than just what you report on. If people actually knew how hard it is to do science, you'd be astonished. And the trope that somehow scientists are like in on the take, paid to like produce results. That's just kind of, it's like so laughable. It doesn't merit like dignity,
Yeah.
So,
there's that Jefferson quote about like, if a claim is ridiculous, it's okay to ridicule it. Like, that's the point of those words being the same word.
Right. Exactly. So, But on the other hand, the fact that we can use scientific methods to figure something out. I mean, whether it's about, that's where I think paleontology has such strong connections to cosmology, astronomy, astrophysics, because you're kind of doing the same thing about figuring out an event that happened a long, long time ago that nobody ever saw, but we can indirectly measure, analyze, and then test our own ideas about what it means. I mean, that's that kind of remote thing. And it's, in many cases, just exhilarating, right? Like this out-of-body experience of like, wow, deep time is so extremely outside the realm of our daily experience that it's hard to capture.
Yeah.
We talk about millions of years. Oh, is it 3 million years ago, 4 million years ago? And it's very casual. But really, when you're like, oh, that happened 100 years ago, that's ancient history.
Right.
That happened in the 80s. Yeah, that I barely remember that. So that kind of context, I think, drives how you talk about the science you do. Because we do want to reach and get people inspired by like the bigger aspects of it. But you're not going to get there unless you explain why you're doing it in the first place. Like, why do you care that I was at a whaling station or Sarabaena or tagging whales? So those, back to your original question, just to close the arc, you have, as a scientist, a range of experiences. And for me, it wasn't just the study organisms are fantastic. Figuring out something about them was pretty gnarly too. And I worked hard in the writing process to flesh out those narratives. There is easily 2/3 more writing of the book that did not enter the final published part. And that's, I think, a
Spying
good thing.
on whales too. This time it's personal.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's like spying harder.
Spying harder.
But I mean, you don't want to read all the. I mean, there's some of those hidden stories that may come out in dark moments, but they ended up on the cutting room floor because they just weren't good enough because they didn't fit with the arcs that I had. So the tripartite structure of past, present, future really worked well for me. And I even, like, just as a side story, I even thought about spinning it, like, I thought it'd be creative and do present, past, future. But I was quickly realized that was a bad idea to be creative like that. And just to have something that was, something easy to track and that brought the reader along and also didn't tax the reader too much. I mean, that's a hard thing to achieve. And because I wrote a lot in a very short amount of time, I think, as an athlete, if writing is like any kind of sport, you get good if you practice a lot and you get sharp. I haven't been really writing for over a year now, almost a whole year. I stopped writing January this year.
Stop writing the book.
Yeah. I finished like January 4th or something at noon. I remember like I wrote, I think, the prologue and the epilogue in like less than a day.
Oh, wow.
They're not very long, but they're important. I mean, my family's in the book. There's just important relationships, important experiences that I've had that are not all necessarily chronological. If I actually put dates on many of these experiences, they wouldn't line up in the book. That's another kind of spoiler, but that was important to me. And also what was important was not emphasizing credentials for anybody, but more what they knew and what they figured out.
Yeah, you talk a lot about like what people bring to the table.
Yeah.
And when you describe their role in things.
The institutions to which they, belong to, or
well, that's one of the
work
things
at.
I love about paleontology and some of the other sciences you mentioned, like astronomy. It's some of the few sciences where amateurs still regularly make contributions.
Right.
Legitimate contributions, because, it's possible for anyone to go find a fossil.
Any day somebody can find something that changes a lot of what we know. It doesn't happen much. I mean, there are a lot more people out there. So I feel like the book was overall a giant vehicle for me to unburden myself of a lot of the stories I had kicking around my head, crazy experiences. I jotted down notes about a lot of those experiences as they happened. I mean, just Cerro Baena was such a complex ordeal. Mm-hmm. I largely wrote that part of the book to just clean up my own memories about it, to kind of give some framework. And I had the people who were part of each chapter read over them and fact check and just say, does this map to your recollection from 5, 6, 7 years ago about how this all went down? Yeah, I think that, maybe you're a little hard on Tuareg, but that's more or less how it happened.
Felt like you were pulling punches on Tuareg. Felt like you were trying to avoid saying.
There's a lot of side stories. How
are we doing on time?
Wrap up this drink.
It's a cool looking drink, right?
Oh yeah. You said it was what kind of old-fashioned?
So it would not be an episode of Science Sort of if we didn't also talk about what we are drinking. So we are having the burnt sugar old fashioned, which is bourbon, a burnt sugar syrup, where they like caramelize it past the point of almost charring it, so it gives it kind of that nice bitterness, and then old fashioned bitters.
It's delicious.
It's one of those drinks, they put it on their winter menu, but they take it off when they change out the seasons.
You have been here a lot, haven't
you? But it's always available. So if you know to order it, you can always get it, which is why I didn't have to look at the menu to know.
That was yeah.
Yeah. No, Julie and I come here. I mean, this is like our favorite cocktail bar in the city, and it would be nice if it was a little closer where we live, but it is walking distance.
Nice.
If you're willing to have a little bit longer walk home, which after a drink or two is usually not a bad
it's actually
call.
not that not a bad idea.
But no, we like coming here a lot. We've like spent New Year's here before. And
That's
stuff.
cool.
So
That's cool.
This is kind of one of our local
like
haunts.
This is my first time here, and I love it. So
yeah,
and we're here early enough that it's not too busy. But.
So I want to talk more about actual whales.
Yeah.
I liked how you talked about how just alien they are and how like different their lives are than how we think of a typical mammal or just any animal on Earth, really. And especially like their intelligence, and you refer to them several times as having culture.
Yeah.
And can we just wax poetic about whales and how cool
I'm
they
not
are?
an anthropologist, so I don't get all verklempt about the use of the word culture, because I kind of, I said this in the book, culture for me is just information transmitted, stored outside of the body that is communicated either across individuals that are contemporaneous or through time over generations. And it's pretty clear whale song is a good example of that. I mean, there was a paper published last month all about the evolution of whale song, which is something I talk about in the prologue. It's been evolving since we've started
recording it. Yeah.
Which is kind of, you think about Big Lebowski, and there's that scene in the bathtub where he's listening to whale song, and you're just kind of like, oh, this is like a nostalgia from the 70s.
Or it's got kind of like a new age hippie sort of vibe to it, but
it totally does. We put it on the Voyager space probes.
We did.
It totally has that trippy aspect. But wait a second, we put it in the greetings category. We presumed a lot more about it than we actually know.
I saw a tweet recently that said like, the Voyager, the golden disc on the Voyager, we included.
Yeah, I know what you're gonna say. Yeah.
Nudes, a mixtape,
nude pic, mixtape, and directions
back to our place, which is a pretty good summation of what humanity tends to do with new technology.
So whales are fundamentally inscrutable to a large degree. What we know about them is, I think, as an anatomist, there's a lot more to know about just their basic biology that we don't know. If you're a behavioral type person, oh my goodness, killer whales, sperm whales. I mean, take any species of whale. It is way more complex than we really know.
Yeah.
And then, this whole aspect of what they're saying to one another. Something I try to emphasize in the book is that whales have been talking to one another and have been pretty brainy for much longer than we've been on the planet. So what kind of conversations were they having to each other
and
for
the fact that
millions of years?
They survived this period of whaling, which, I mean, that's like a horrific thing if you have a long memory. And
it's clear that there are whales that remember whaling.
And lived with your family and lost a bunch of them.
Right.
Like, that's kind of a really sad, melancholic story.
So we still share the planet with whales, and I think that's, the big question is like, well, what's going to happen? I mean, it's pretty clear that the scale of our impact, our just presence on the planet is immense. We are everywhere. We leave our stuff everywhere, or whether it's our detritus or
our Titanics.
Yeah, exactly. So, it's hard to be a whale and not encounter humanity in some degree. So it's not so surprising to me that we are having an impact on their lives, and that impact is time transgressive, right? Like, there are right whales out there in the ocean that are tangled in lobster traps, and they're dragging those traps over thousands of miles. That is having a major impact on their reproductive health, on the animal's health, day to day, and there are only a few hundred of them left. They have not really recovered from whaling. So, whereas a humpback, a gray whale, they seem to have, after we stopped whaling them, they've rebounded. So there's something really different about being a right whale than there is about these other kinds of whales that has led to this differential success. And that's something I really wanted to sketch out, is like take good examples of whales that are around today and kind of roll it out into the future. And in some cases, that required taking a step back in historical time. So, with bowheads, I was just actually in Sitka hanging out with Craig George, who was in the bowhead chapter. He's the guy who largely led the effort to figure out how old bowhead whales really are. And that number of over 200 years. What he told me in Sitka, we were just talking, we were on a whale watch out in Southeast Alaska, and we were just chatting, and he said, the Inupiat elders talk about, they always said bowheads live 2 lives, 2 human lifetimes.
Wow.
And, that's kind of like, well, is that like 120 years? Like, how long do humans live? But clearly, traditional ecological knowledge has a role to play in anything we want to know about Arctic marine mammals, especially bowhead whales. And so that's part of the mystery of not knowing about them. We have to go back into historical time. It relates to whaling and indigenous cultures, because that's a whaling tradition that still goes on today, and go into the future. We know how the Arctic is going to turn out in the next few decades. That course is set. The Arctic is melting. There's going to be ice-free summers, probably around the time my kids graduate from high school. That's kind of nuts, assuming a linear downward progression and not anything different. So what does that mean for the fate of these whales that we barely know anything about, and the facts we do know about them are crazy?
Yeah.
So I wanted to kind of like sketch that out. I thought they were useful vehicles for understanding system-wide changes happening to our planet. Is almost whales as like a vehicle for global climate change.
Yeah.
Which I think is still pretty useful. And that could be earwax in blue whales, seems to record.
Also in Objects of Wonder.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's a chronicle there. And the fact that chronicle is extremely faithful to changes in population size that probably map to stresses on these populations. That is nuts.
Yeah. It's a really cool record that exists.
So, I mean, I think that goes back to the Speaker of the Dead aspect, is that we have all these objects, and I do think we need to defend why we keep them in museum collections. I mean, axiomatically, they're important for us as scientists because you want to go answer your questions. That means going into museum collections. But, there are people who question the value of keeping that. That takes a lot of resources to manage.
Oh, yeah. Organize, I mean, I've been spending a lot of time out at the museum support complex, and not a lot of people realize that, like, as big as the Smithsonian Museum, the Smithsonian Natural History Museum on the mall downtown in D.C. is, it's not big enough to house all the whales because whales are huge.
Yep. And so that's I was actually on this tour today trying to communicate that the scale of challenges that I contemplate within a museum setting every day sometimes are paralyzing to me. I mean, there's just so much work to be done, and I have to be kind of selective about what I think about undertaking, either in a research context, a collections context. I mean, these are all efforts that require just some fraction of the 24-hour day.
I liked how you framed a part of that idea in the book when you talked just about how, like, one of the smallest species of whales, a dolphin, the skull fits comfortably on a desk, but you still need two hands to pick it up and manipulate it. So, like, that's, the scale of animals we're dealing with on the small end.
Right. I've done dissections of some of these small porpoises, and
they small terrible. I know you said you weren't that bothered by the smell.
No, actually, there's like something about some of the lipids that gets me really excited. I get like that excited science feel about things. But dead marine reptile, turtles,
dead marine reptile?
Yeah, sea turtles are awful.
Really?
Oh yeah. Yeah, they rot quicker or faster. There's some pathway. I've only ever almost lost my lunch once, and that was when I saw blood spilling out of a really dead bottlenose dolphin on a beach. There's something about like the sudden gush of blood and the smell coming out of it that almost tipped me over the edge. But generally in the laboratory confines, I'm okay with all the blood. It's just a way of knowing. It's a way of dealing with them.
I will gag from the smell without actually being grossed out. Like, it's like an actual physiological reaction of just like, I'll smell something that's really gross from a sloth.
Yeah.
One time I was trying to get a stomach sample from a sloth with one of those increment bores that we'd use for tree rings. And this is Mark's idea, by the way.
Okay.
and the sloth was still pretty frozen, so I was like that was the whole idea behind using the increment bores. We wouldn't have to completely thaw the thing out to take a stomach sample. So I'm like trying to get through, and I'm like really cranking it down, and I punctured the stomach, and the increment bore is hollow, so all the gas that had been trapped in the stomach just went straight up the bore into my face that I was standing over, and I was hacking for a few minutes there. But I went into town and got some Vicks Vapor Rub to start rubbing menthol under my nose after that. But
I mean, it's a whole different deal when we were at the whaling station because that was just everywhere. I mean, that's 50, 60 tons of whale, most of which is being churned in a boiler pit beneath you. So that like smell that like enters your nostrils and the roof of your mouth, it kind of doesn't leave. That was. I rarely smell that, but the times I get something close to that, I'm just like, oh yeah, that's too much.
As scientists, we've talked a lot about like the different tools that we can use to get data from these animals that are really enigmatic and difficult. But does it ever frustrate you that whales are probably smart enough that we could have some semblance of a conversation if we just spoke the language?
I mean, it's clear that...
Or am I completely overextending how smart they are?
There's a great book written by Carl Safina called Beyond Words, and it's all about animal communication. Carl's a marine ecologist, and he talks a lot about, he's written some great books about sea turtles, about seabirds, and this is, I think it's his most recent. It's about animal communication. He has a whole chapter about killer whales, and there's some fascinating interactions anecdotally between humans and captive killer whales, where it really seems, based on the chronicle of interactions, that killer whales are perceiving more about us than we recognize. So that's just, I'm not like getting new agey, but I'm just saying like they're able to perceive a lot about our gestures and our intents more than we think we're revealing. It's kind of a clever Hans horse story.
The horse who could count,
right?
Supposedly.
So
or
like
do math, I guess.
Yeah. So like they're mammals. They're intuitive. They're reading,
and they're social.
Yeah, they're social, and they're reading a whole range of a spectrum of communication coming from micro gestures of facial muscles and our hands, because we're bipedal. And, we've kept them in captivity, so they're probably pretty bored. Right?
Oh, yeah. No, I think they're completely understimulated in captivity. I mean, as much as the new thinking about having animals in captivity, even animals we don't consider smart, we talked about this on the show recently, benefit from having stimulating objects, new things to look at, new things to interact with.
There's a reason why octopuses are escape artists. They're just like...
Or and orangutans, too.
Yeah, exactly.
There was that one where they had to start putting undercover zookeepers in the crowd just outside its enclosure so it would stop trying to escape.
That's funny.
Yeah.
So given that, whales are diverse, they're clearly very brainy, they're saying a lot, just by information content through the ways that they communicate. Yeah, I don't have an issue with calling it culture. Now, what does it mean? That's your question of can we communicate? Can we tell them, humans?
If we could just tell the beaked whales, thank you so much.
Thank you. Cheers.
Just hang out at the surface for a minute and let us get your pulse because it's important to keep you alive.
Yeah.
I think, would they be smart enough to go, okay, I'll hang out for a second.
Yeah, high five, dude. Yeah, we will actually. I do know about data sets on heart rate.
We went through the Ocean Hall a little bit to look at the new Sea Monsters exhibit when my parents were in town for Thanksgiving, and my dad did have a moment. He's like, my dad's an orthopedic surgeon, so he knows skeletons, but he saw the front flipper of a whale and was like, those are all the phalanges. I was like, yeah, they're still
homology,
in there. Yeah,
yes.
That's what I told him. I was like, we have a word for that. It's called homology.
Yeah, and it's amazing that hasn't been lost. I mean, the fact that you can find almost any vertebrate after the Permian on the planet, and they're 5 digits.
Any tetrapod.
Yeah, any tetrapod on the planet.
So coelacanth is not far away. But.
Yes, correct. But, most tetrapods have 5 or less, but not really more. What is it? I mean, that's an evolutionary biology. That's a graduate school thesis question. But yeah, there are some there's these sort of ways that biology works that seem pretty successful and static that are hard to change. And that's, for me, that's what makes whales pretty damn interesting, is that they have these innovations that have no precedent. Filter feeding. There is no other filter feeding mammal on the planet the way that whales do it. Echolocation underwater. There's no other mammal.
I know there are paleontologists who say that plesiosaurs might have been filter feeders, and
I don't see how that's possible.
I'm not yet convinced by any argument they've made, so I agree with you.
So filter feeding, when I think about filter feeding, I think about the coffee I make in the morning, I think about the beer I drink at night. Those are 2 ways that the physical process of separating out substrate from surrounding media, whether, fluid, could be, air, that's what a filter does. And there's clearly a lot of different mechanisms. There was one that was just recently described for manta rays, ricochet feeding. That's a different kind of filter feeding. It's kind of a different specialized mode. There's cross-flow filtration. There's dead-end sieving. So what ways are filter feeding whales using their baleen? We don't know. We need to test we need to model that and test that. So I think that's what makes, here, Maya Balena, story about the origin of baleen, in part about this. Had neither teeth nor baleen. How baleen ever gets started in the first place, that's still a big question. And especially more so by not even knowing how it works in today's world, we're going to have a lot harder problem to actually trace its origins evolutionarily. So that's what's exciting for me. I really do think
there's still a lot of work to do.
We're in the golden age of whale science, and that should be that's what I hope to achieve in the book, was some kind of narrative that was inspiring and kind of, an 18-year-old could read and say, you know what, this sounds like fun. I see there's things to do.
When people think about paleontology, they often think of an era in time when things were huge and majestic and gigantic. And one of that is our taphonomic filters. Big things preserve more easily. And another is there were some truly charismatic giant megafauna in the past. But when they asked what the biggest thing ever was, and I tell them it's alive today, it's the blue whale. We live in the age of giants. This is it is a very cool time to be alive and looking at the world around us, as well as all the cool fossil forms that we have to look at too.
I mean, I would pick 2018 as a time to be alive if I had my druthers. So we talked about how remarkable it is to find anything in the fossil record, and that's what makes knowing anything about these great evolutionary stories, whether it's the transition from dinosaurs to true birds that we can actually document in the fossil record, or the first tetrapods to come on land. I mean, The fact that we can find those fossils, we can put them into a framework. This idea of a family tree, a genealogy, the history of life as the tree of life, that's a human construct, right? Like we all axiomatically agree there is one true tree of life out there.
Yeah.
We're probably never going to know it. It probably has a lot of kinks and dead branches and reticulating branches if you're bacteria or, corn.
Yeah. And that weird piece from Mars that landed here one time. Who it could.
I mean, to me, that's a big question did life happen many times on this planet?
I've thought about that too.
Are there multiple origins to life and we don't and how would we test that?
Yep. And how do we know they didn't all just, like you said, combine together at some point? I mean, mitochondria in our own cells.
There may be a last universal common ancestor or not.
Right.
Or there could be multiple roots. I mean,
or life could have evolved many times before one time it actually worked.
So there's a good book called Light of the Stars, written by Adam Frank, that came out this year. That was all about acknowledging the reality that given all the exoplanets that are being described, we need to start rethinking our approach to the Drake equation. Do you talk about the Drake equation?
I'm sure we have before, but yeah.
So you'll just have to cue it up, link to.
Yeah.
But the fact that there's going to be some parts of the Drake equation that we have to change because we're finding so many more habitable planets, and that leads to the distinct possibility that those habitable planets maybe had life because the universe is much older than this planet, and it kind of just by probabilities you have to think. There's way too many opportunities for life to have also evolved elsewhere. And
it would be a hell of a coincidence if we were the first ones on the scene, right? I mean, it's the Carl Sagan quote, it'd be a hell of a waste of space, right?
So it makes,
That was Carl Sagan.
I think so. I'm not sure. Yeah.
Contact. It's
good.
the line from Contact.
Yeah. So, that's what makes planetary geology so fascinating is that Mars, Venus, those are, and even Mercury to a certain extent, those are potential alt Earths. If you rewind the clock back to 4 billion years ago, any one of the, Mars maybe stood the best chance, but even it looks like the moons of Jupiter and Saturn are also great candidates too.
And we look at Archeans and we see these extreme environments that they can live in, and environments that were probably very similar to early Earth. It strains credulity that there wouldn't be a ton of life out there. And I thought about that while I was reading your book, because you do talk about the alienness of whales.
Yeah.
And I had this image in my head of what if we went to another planet and there was intelligent life, but we just we didn't think of them as intelligent, so we're out there trying to tag them, and they're trying to be what are you doing? Leave me alone.
Yeah. I kind of think there's a bunch of sci-fi novels that are like this, that have made this argument that silicon-based life is probably the best. That's the kind of alien life we might most likely encounter, and that does change things dramatically.
Yeah.
Not biological life, but we've emitted electromagnetic radiation for. This is the contact thing, a few hundred years, that sphere is now passed outside of our solar system. So, we've already been sending out, it's not just the Voyager
noisy
probes.
Neighbors.
Yeah, and we're noisy neighbors. So, is other life thinking that we're tasty? Or are we just not worth it? Are they even, or that it cuts the other direction, which is life may not survive long enough to leave a trace.
It's part of the Drake equation. Yeah.
Right. And so the longevity of these civilizations as the outgrowth of life.
We might be surrounded, but just too far apart to ever have a conversation.
To have that conversation or to know about, it may be a ghost universe. So, it's pretty dark.
Well, we got Voyager out there, right?
We do have Voyager. This whole story of Voyager is fascinating because it was largely... I think there's one person in the 60s who realized, what is it called, the Great Tour? Because the alignment of the planets was only going to be like that at that time in the late 20th century and not again for 250 years. So there was this moment to make the case to the Nixon administration that this is what we had to do. And it was signed off on. And we did it, and it's really technically hard. The crazy success that NASA has to sending out these probes makes it seem kind of expected and routine, getting the images about Pluto. It's that's great. I think you can't spike the football hard enough, in that way that we know something about that. And it's not just kind of far away, it is so far away. You can go down to Air and Space Museum and actually walk out the relative proportions of Pluto.
I want to do a road trip through Sweden where you do, because Sweden has the largest scale model of the solar system.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, you start like near Stockholm at the sun, and then you have to drive, and you're in the Arctic Circle by the time you're in the, Oort cloud and Pluto and stuff. So I want to, if I ever have the chance to do like a travel documentary style thing, I would love to do.
That'd be fun. Yeah.
The scale model of the solar system in Sweden.
And if you drink the entire way.
Oh, of course. Yeah, I would need a driver.
Shots at every stop.
So, final thoughts. What's next for... It's part of your book, so you don't have to spoil anything in the book, but what's next for you and what's next for the whales?
Oh, well, for me, it's finding out... I mean, there's so many... I left Maya Bellina, for example. I have a 3D print of its jaw. That was an Easter egg inside the book, and I kind of tweeted out about this, that, I knew Maya Bellina was going to happen, so I could write about it and not spoil too much about it.
Right.
So, I mean, there's a lot more fossil whales to describe. There's more kind of little mini sequels to Cerobiana, more to talk about what we know about the anatomy that we've discovered, our collaborators have figured out from Iceland. Those are all just kind of like, that's all part of the machinery of doing science, that it's yielding more discoveries. But I think that, in the bigger picture, what I've realized in talking to a lot of people who've read the book is that these narratives about how we talk about science are really important. And I hope there's a spine on sloths. I hope there's so much more to this way of talking about the work we do as scientists becomes much more widespread, because I think it makes it accessible. What's true about whales can be true about snails, about birds, about any organism. And there are a great number of science writers out there, and I hope they all write many, many books in this way, especially first-person narratives. So I guess my hope would be those scientists out there who are thinking about writing a book, do write a book. And there's, science communication is a big tent. You could do a graphic novel. You could do a podcast. You could do a lot of different ways in a lot of different modes. And I think it's, for me, writing was my mode. But also, I'd be remiss not to shout out to Alex Boersma, who did 26 original pieces of lino cut art. Yeah. So,
because they actually kind of evoke Scrimshaw.
Yeah, I thought so too. Yeah, and I wanted one coherent aesthetic to the book. And there's anachronistic stuff for looking like, old kind of artistic style. There's laser arm scanners in there.
I thought that was fun. I was like, man, he must have had some good reference photos to be able to get those accurately portrayed.
I mean, that was the benefit of having Alex do the art, because she was a researcher in my group.
Cool.
So she and I, we've published on several fossils. She's described 3 new genera and species of fossil whales in her time in my lab. And she also spent time in Jeremy Goldbogen's lab at Stanford, too. So, she has intimate knowledge of the material objects.
I think when you say a graphic novel, you've got a potential collaborator there.
I mean, I think the next thing I'd like to do is probably focus more on young adult to children's books, because
awesome.
I think they are future voters. They're actually the ones who are going to get us out of all the problems we have today and that we've inherited from 150 years of burning fossil fuels. So... yeah,
I'd love it if there was like a historical newspaper of like, instead of millennials replace it with a new generation, like they're killing the whaling industry because millennials are killing every other industry.
Yeah, the avocado toast industry.
So where can people follow along with your future adventures?
Oh my goodness!
I know you're on Twitter.
Yeah, Twitter. I mean, so I am not a maven of either modes. I like Twitter because I use Twitter every day. I find out something new about science, about like in a research capacity from Twitter. The community is that big.
You recently found out that I'm an award-winning speaker.
Absolutely, I did, yeah. Hey, and you have the Bradley Bowl, right?
I do. Well, I haven't gotten it yet.
You need to drink from it. It's like the Stanley Cup. You need to
I just found out I won on Wednesday, and they have to get my name engraved in it, apparently.
Okay,
so.
I want to see a tweet. I want to see a photo
evidence. I'm going to put it in my office at Smithsonian.
Drink from it. I did. I drank from I was the 2010 Bradley.
Oh, I didn't. I mean, I'll know that once I see your name etched in it.
Yeah, it's kind of like the Stanley Cup, which appeals to me as a hockey fan. But so yeah, and Instagram, I still use it in the old way, not the new way of like just a static image and a
You're
few
not telling
hashtags.
your Instagram stories or whatever.
No, I can't actually figure out highlights from stories. So
yeah. Okay, cool. So what are your Twitter accounts and Instagram?
Oh, Pyenson Lab, or just
Pyenson Lab.
look for Nick Pyenson on social media. So yeah.
And then obviously go check out the book, available from fine retailers everywhere.
Absolutely.
And
yeah.
Nick, thank you so much for joining me here on the podcast to talk about it.
It was delicious and fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thanks again to Nick for joining me to tell me about his research, and by telling me, by extension, all of you. It really is a great book. I think it would be a good one to give to an animal-loving friend or family member in your life. It is sort of the tail end of the holiday season, but, books can be evergreen in that way. So go check it out if you have the chance and are interested in whales. I think you will learn a lot. I certainly learned a lot, and it's always good to catch up with Nick, and hopefully this will not be the last time we hear from him on the show. This is our last episode of the year, and I want to thank everyone who has been a supporter of the show this year and all previous years that we've done the show. We're coming up on the big episode 300, and we're kind of trying to figure out what to do both for that episode and for the future of the show in the new year. It'll be our 10th anniversary next year, so big thoughts, big things on the horizon. Maybe, I don't know. We're figuring that out. So your support, both financially and just in spirit, goes a long way towards making the show worth doing for all of us. So I just want to thank all you listeners on behalf of myself and everyone who helps make the show possible. So all of my co-hosts, Patrick, Charlie, Kelly, Abe, Joe, and Ben, as well as our audio guy, Tim, and our graphics guy, Thomas. That's the crew that's working hard to make each episode happen and to keep things updated and moving smoothly on the back end. So thanks to all of them. Thanks to all of you. And we'll be back in the new year with more of those Patreon goals and fun stuff like that. So patreon.com/sciencesortof. But for this time, I want to do a little bit of a throwback and thank one of our old PayPal recurring donors, Ian C. So Ian, this episode is dedicated to you. Hopefully you are a fan of cetaceans, because this episode happened in part thanks to the money you gave us via the recurring donation feature on PayPal. Since I don't always remember to plug it, also please remember that you can support the show via our Amazon affiliate page. There's a link to that on the ScienceSortof.com page, or you can go to ScienceSortof.com/Amazon. You can also connect with us on social media, Twitter @ScienceSortof.com and Facebook.com/ScienceSortof. I think that's about it. I know 2018 was rough for a lot of people, so I hope everyone is celebrating the end of the year happily and safely and looking forward to a brighter 2019 for all of us. So with that, thank you so much for listening. Please come back next episode. I had a really amazingly productive time at AGU, so you're going to be getting a number of episodes featuring some of the content I recorded there with a number of different researchers, and I think you'll be really pleasantly surprised by some of the stuff I was able to record. But no matter what we decide to feature for our next episode 299, you can be sure that it will feature a whole lot more science. That was whale for sort of. That's all I got.
Visit ScienceSortof.com for show notes, links to all the stories we talked about, and ways to interact with the hosts, guests, and other listeners. Science Sort of is brought to you by the Brachiolobe Media Network of podcasts, with audio engineering by Tim Dobbs of the Encyclopedia Brunch podcast. That's all for this week. See you next time on Science Sort of.
Goodness.
Thank you.
Those.
This is my.
Hold on. I'm not a millennial. I sometimes caucus with millennials, but
I consider myself a millennial.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm on the older side for millennial, but cheers, sir. Thank you for joining me.
Oh, that's good. Happy to be here.
Should we dive right in?
Yeah, we can.
Ha 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 ha.